Hillary Clinton is in Afghanistan. A secretly planned, publicly unscheduled visit on the occasion of that country's president being sworn in for another term tomorrow after an election in which the UN says nearly a third of the votes counted for him were fraudulent. President Bush used to talk regularly with Hamid Karzai, and Karzai was frequently invited to Washington, D.C., where a fawning U.S. press could always be counted on to compliment his hat. President Obama has, in contrast, kept Karzai at arm's length. He's abandoned the regular phone conferences that Bush did. And Hillary Clinton is as yet the highest-ranking Obama administration visitor to Mr. Karzai. And if her comments today are anything to go by, Secretary Clinton appears to be in Kabul mostly to tell Mr. Karzai how corrupt she thinks he is. She complained openly to reporters today that one of Karzai's choices for vice president is considered by the United States government to be essentially a drug runner. Clinton's visit comes on the day that the Afghan Minister of Mines is alleged to have accepted a $30 million bribe. It comes one day after a report listed Afghanistan as the world's second most corrupt country, after only Somalia, which frankly barely qualifies as a country at all anymore. President Obama today did a number of TV interviews in which he was asked repeatedly about his plans for Afghanistan. He said he is close to announcing his decisions about the war, and he struck some fear into those inside his own government who have been leaking details about his decision.
We are very close to a decision. I will announce that decision certainly in the next several weeks. We have these deliberations in the Situation Room for a reason, for people to be releasing information during the course of deliberations where we haven't made final decisions yet, I think is not appropriate.
Is that a firing offense?
Absolutely.
While the president tries to stem leaks, to buy himself more time for his Afghanistan decision, and to crack the whip on our supposed partners in the Afghan government, here's one giant, game-changing, brand-new fact, reported by Spencer Ackerman today, that should change the whole way the country talks about and thinks about this war. Mr. Ackerman says Army data show that if the president orders 30 or 40,000 more troops to Afghanistan, quote, he will be deploying practically every available U.S. Army brigade to war, leaving few units in reserve in case of an unforeseen emergency. Joining us now is Spencer Ackerman, senior reporter at the Washington Independent. Spencer, thanks very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
So explain what the Army has told you. If Obama wants to send, say, 40,000 troops, how many active duty soldiers are available to him to make that happen?
As of December, when he'll announce the decision, there are 50,600 active duty Army soldiers who would be capable of deploying at that point. That means if we end up going with 40,000, then we will have nearly every soldier in the United States Army on active duty, either in Iraq or in Afghanistan, or ineligible to deploy because they're waiting to recover from a previous deployment. So if something happens, God forbid, elsewhere in the world, in Iran or in North Korea, that requires the United States Army to mobilize, we'll have very, very little left in store.
Of the troops that would be available to deploy, how many how many other combat tours have those brigades done? I know that asking what sort of shape they're in to be fighting and how reasonable it is for us as a country to ask them to deploy is a complicated thing, but how many tours have these divisions or these brigades done?
Only one of these brigades will have not deployed at all. Almost all of them have served 2 tours. 4 of them have served 3. Several of them are now at a point where, 2 of them in particular, this would be their 5th tour.
So if he wants to send 40,000 troops, in all likelihood, he's going to have to send brigades back for which it would be their 5th tour?
Since 2002, that's right.
Is it General McChrystal's responsibility to factor in things like how many troops are available to the country in the event of an emergency somewhere else when he makes his request for troops in Afghanistan? I mean, General McChrystal's really only responsible for Afghanistan, right?
General McChrystal is only responsible for Afghanistan. There's a structural problem whereby oftentimes when we're factoring in military decisions, we don't look at objective constraints. That's just been the way it goes. If this were, say, healthcare, we would have imposed a cost constraint, we would have imposed a time constraint, and so forth. But General McChrystal has to look at what the needs of the Afghanistan Afghanistan war and what he needs to, in his perspective, become successful there. And so he looks at that just on that line. And so it's the responsibility of the president to decide what's in the broader interest of American national security.
Spencer, I know that it is usually stupid to compare Iraq and Afghanistan, but a lot of people said that we were already at capacity when President Bush made the decision to order the troop surge in Iraq back in 2006. And frankly, we were able to do that. There weren't catastrophic consequences for the United States in terms of our readiness, at least not those that we talked about. Why shouldn't we think that the situation is the same in Afghanistan, that it'll be a stretch, but we can just pull it off?
No matter what, this is a risk. I mean, we've been fighting in Afghanistan for 8 years now. But, you know, perhaps nothing will occur outside of Iraq or Afghanistan at that point. The issue is, someone told me for this story, how much risk are you willing to accept? Unlike Iraq, Afghanistan's escalation is being talked about in terms of not being a one-time surge where when the initial brigades used for escalation go home, the whole thing goes back to where it was before, but a sustained escalation whereby new brigades have to come in and relieve the ones that go home initially. So we don't really know how long that we'll be at this escalation, at what point will we have an exit strategy in place, at what point will we be successful. So it's not exactly the same thing as in Iraq.
This is so important. I mean, we've talked about so many elements of the war effort, talking about the actual constraints of what we are capable of doing. It's almost verboten in American politics, but it sounds like absolutely a hard ceiling that needs to be considered here. Spencer, thank you for your reporting. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel.
Spencer Ackerman's a senior reporter at The Washington Independent.